Welcome back to Cove Street Boatworks, a show dedicated to hobbyists and passionate amateurs interested in wooden boat building and restoration. I'm your host, Max Mattoon. After being on a business trip for the past week, I was anxious to get back to the shop here and do a new episode. We're going to do a fairly short episode today, and we're going to talk about marine caulk and adhesives. There's a lot of use and misuse of this. We're going to talk about two major types of marine caulking, that being polyurethane or polysulfide based, and we're going to talk about when and where to apply these. So we're going to start out with the differentiation between polyurethane caulk, which is Sikaflex 291 LOT or 3M5200, which I don't happen to have an example of here today, and Boatlife caulk, which is an example of polysulfide caulk. Polyurethanes are the choice for below the waterline type of applications where limited movement is expected. 5200, 3M5200 has the highest adhesive quality, but the least flexibility when cured. So that makes it ideal for things like joining timbers together, like this ugly S-boat stem that we have here. If you have an inner and an outer stem construction and you wanted to join these two pieces together, it would be ideal in conjunction with mechanical fasteners. It's also ideal for double planked bottoms, Chris Crafts, Garwoods, Hacker Crafts. Anytime you had double planked bottoms, 5200 works really, really well on those because there's some resiliency to it. As you're passing through the water, it's not going to be bashing about and cracking those glue joints, so it's much more forgiving. So that's another place where it works really, really well. It also works well where you have high strength hardware that you want to bond to a hull. It's not easy to get off, but if you're looking for something that's really going to augment the fasteners and keep a piece of hardware on the hull, 5200 is going to be your thing. Sikaflex 291 long open time LOT. All right, this is a restorer's choice for tasks requiring the product to have less adhesive qualities and more flexibility. Still much higher adhesive quality than a polysulfide like Boatlife caulk, which we'll look at next. So this is a good choice for mahogany deck seams, for example, for hardware bedding that requires more sealant quality and with a little bit of adhesion, and for seams below the waterline that have expected movement as the wood soaks up. This would be our choice. Seams that are on the wider side of narrow, so to speak, say, you know, if it's a 1/2 inch thick plank, because that's going to make a difference. For fairly lightweight planks, if you have seam gaps of 3/16 to 1/4 of an inch, this works really, really well because there's enough flexibility in it to allow the seams, the planks, to move a little bit as they swell up without causing dents or impediments to the edge of the plank. Once those plank edges are dented, they'll never ever swell up and come back together properly. Or worse, if this does get really hard and the planks have quite a bit of swelling to do, what it can do is put the planks and the fasteners, the plank fasteners in shear, and it can break plank fasteners. Or if your frames are light enough, it can actually break the frames. I've seen that on fan Bowens before. So this works well, really well under the water. The colors, this comes in teak, it comes in black, white, mahogany. There's different additives to make the colors, and it gives a different quality to the caulk. So if you're going to be using Sikaflex for mahogany deck seams on an older runabout, more than likely those deck seams have been cleaned out multiple times and they're no longer uniform. So you wouldn't want to caulk them straight ahead with a white colored caulk because you're going to see variability. It's going to stand out like night and day on the beautiful mahogany hull on the deck. So you want to try to mask that. So one of the tricks that we do is we use mahogany caulk in those deck seams initially, and therefore the irregularity in those seams tends to blend in. But one of the challenges you have is that the additives that they put into Sikaflex mahogany caulk give the caulk a graininess, much, much different than black or white, which are very, very smooth. So if you were to apply a pinstriping tool with white paint to try to stripe those seams in a nice crisp way over this directly, there's enough graininess in this that the paint, even if you have a fairly heavy, sign painter's paint, it'll flow a little unpredictably, and sometimes there'll be some high spots that won't fill quite right. And if you've ever tried it, pinstriping deck seams more than one shot is never going to work. You're never going to get that uniform coat of paint on it. So what you have to do is make sure that when you caulk the deck with mahogany sealant, mahogany caulk like this, is that you tape off both sides of the seams and you put enough caulk in there to make sure that there's a slight cove in the shape of that caulk, that it's below the surface a little bit, and then you varnish the deck once or twice. The varnish will make this smooth without putting too much of a film on it, so that you have a tendency to crack if you had too thick a film finish over that, because this is a little flexible. And then you can stripe over the top of that pretty well. It works very well, gives you a nice crisp edge. So that's one of the purposes for this, and double planked bottoms is another place that this is often used, along with 5200. 5200 is certainly going to have more adhesive quality, but this is more than adequate adhesion if it's well mechanically fastened as well. So both this and 5200 will give you more resiliency for pounding of the hull over good waves, or the working and twisting of the hull, as opposed to a hard bottom, an epoxy bottom. Epoxy bottoms become monocot structures. The problem is you're employing a monocot structure only to the bottom. The sides on those boats are still traditional. They're framed, they're batten seam planks. So if the bottom doesn't work, that energy that's being transferred to the hull as you crash through those waves is going to go somewhere. And it's going to go to the interface between that new epoxy bottom that you just put on your hull and the rest of the traditional structure, typically starting at the chines. And you're going to start working those fasteners. And over a period of time, you're going to see some punishment in those areas. And you're going to see wear and tear and stress in an area of the hull that you wouldn't normally see. Putting this kind of bottom on, either 5200 or Sikaflex, is going to, it's going to minimize the impact of that concentration of stress in the hull, and it will increase the longevity and the performance of the hull overall. Both 5200, 3M 5200 and Sikaflex say that they are sandable and paintable. We've already talked about the paintable aspect of it. From a sandability point of view, neither of them really sand. You can attempt to sand it, but there's enough flexibility. As you pass a sander over it, even with a big heavy grit on it, it deflects. And what you end up doing is grinding the wood on either side of the seam more than you would like to. So the best way to take care of Sikaflex or 5200 is to very, very carefully mask it, clean it up afterwards before it's cured, and then any deposits you want to remove afterwards, the best way to do it is with a razor blade or with very, very sharp chisels or scrapers, rather than trying to sand it. And you can often use the old body shop trick. I don't have a razor blade right here. I thought I did, but let's pretend this is a razor blade. If this was a razor blade, like a safety razor blade or something, you take a piece of masking tape and you tape around one side and then around the other, leaving the middle open and sharp. And that would give you just enough of a shim as you slide the razor blade across the surface of that seam you're trying to trim down, so that it wouldn't scrape the varnish, but it would take care of anything that was in the middle between the two pieces of tape. Works really, really well. Auto body shops used to use it to cut dust nubs off of paint jobs. So they would be very selective, and depending on the thickness of the tape, they could get really, really close to the surface, and it was really cheap. Once the blade was dull, they just throw it away and create another one. So great trick. And the last class we're going to look at, the last class of caulks, is going to be the polysulfides. And classically, Boatlife, they make a whole variety of them. All these manufacturers make a variety of polysulfide and polyurethane caulks these days, but 3M5200 and Sikaflex, I think, are probably the most prevalent in boat restoration shops when it comes to polyurethane caulks. Everybody's used to using them. They're very dependable. Everybody knows their properties and characteristics. And certainly from a polysulfide perspective, Life Caulk, Boatlife, and for deck seams like teak deck seams, Boatlife has teak deck seams, teak deck seam sealant, which has a different formulation that sticks fairly well to teak, which is a very oily wood, very difficult to get things to adhere to it. So these are all sort of polysulfide products. In particular, let's talk about Life Caulk, which is their sort of flagship polysulfide product. This is used where we need a minimum amount of adhesive kind of qualities, but we need a maximum amount of sealing and flexibility. So this can be used classically under pieces of hardware on a deck that are going to be on and off the boat periodically. If you use 5200 or Sikaflex to bond those, it will work, but getting them off will be a nightmare. This is a fairly easy job to get in there with a sharp putty knife or something and just split the seal and have it come off. And it remains flexible and it works really well as far as sealant goes. This is also used underwater, under the waterline, where the seams are wide or when the boat has been out of the water for a long time and you expect there to be a lot of plank movement as the boat soaks up. But there's a challenge here. When you have wide seams, and we're talking about seams that are 1/4 inch or wider, which is getting to be on the really wide side, especially if the boat has been out of the water. We're not just talking about an old tired boat. We're talking about a boat that's been out of the water for a couple seasons. It hasn't been soaked up. And you know there's going to be a lot of movement as that hull reaches, the planking reaches a different ambient moisture content. You want to use something that has a lot of flexibility, which is going to imply that it has low adhesive qualities. Here's the problem. You can get this into the seam and you can feel good that it's not going to damage the fasteners or the frames or anything else as those planks seal, and it's going to work, and yeah, it's going to squeeze it out, but you can always go with a scraper and trim it off. And for the first season you get a boat back in the water, who cares, right? It's in the water, it's sealed up tight, it's not leaking, you're in a good place. The problem is if you are working at the boatyard and you're putting this into seams that are greater than 1/4 inch, because of its low adhesive quality, if you're moving that boat from the yard, 5 miles down the road on a trailer to where you're going to launch it, it's not necessarily going to stay in the seams. And what we see a lot is on the road, this stuff will literally drop out of the seams, and that becomes a problem. So keep that in mind. We're talking really poor adhesive quality with this kind of caulk, while it does have all those great characteristics of remaining flexible even when it's cured and allowing a lot of plank movement, and at the same time sealing up any kind of water. There are going to be challenges with this. So sometimes this isn't going to be the best solution for underwater use. And I'll show you here, if I can pull it in front of the camera. I have a plank here. I don't know if I can get it to focus on this. This is 5200 on a mahogany plank. And I probably don't have enough light here. I'll take a look at this later. I don't think I can do this. But anyways, if I pull this caulk off, it's not going to come off without damaging the wood. There's just no freaking way. So it's extremely tenacious. You can see there was a lot of 5200 used on this particular mahogany plank. Getting it off, it was even used against the frames. And getting this off, you can see how tenacious it is. I mean, you can't just scrape this off. It is stuck on there, rock hard. If this was Boatlife, a polysulfide, I could roll it off. It would come off really easily. This, I'm going to have a super sharp scraper or a chisel to get off. Yeah, it adhered really well, but this was an edge glued plank. And it held up well because it was above the water line. You can see the water line on this piece. This was above the water line, so there wasn't a lot of movement in it. This was an old 1980s way of approaching vintage boats where they said, oh, if it's above the water line, we'll just 5200 edge glue it. And it did work. Of course, it made maintenance a nightmare because you have to run a razor blade down these seams to get the plank off. It's not going to just, come off easily. So there's trade-offs with all of this. I hope you've enjoyed this short look at polysulfide and polyurethane caulks and their applications. I see this misapplied all the time, especially with wood boat bottoms and things like that, double planked bottoms. Really think about what you're using and why you're using it. Take a look at the manufacturer's technical specifications. Make sure you're using the right product for the right purpose. I'm going to try to do 2 this weekend because I'm traveling all again next week, and I probably won't have a chance to work another one up. So we're going to take a look at a couple projects in the yard. And I thought to try to get my viewers a little more engaged, I would do a fairly quick survey of the projects in the yard. They're small, they're fairly simple projects. We're going to look at a beetle cat, I think, tomorrow if the weather clears up a little bit here. And I'm gonna just look at the condition. I'm gonna describe it and video it for you. And then I'd like to hear from you all about how you would approach this project. What would be some of your concerns, what you would do first, what you thought were the priorities in the restoration. If we were just planning on putting this thing back in the water with our kids or grandkids or with our significant other. So there is some concern about the viability of the boat and the safety of the boat, but that's going to be our primary concern. We're not going to worry about restoring it back to magnificent showroom condition. We want it serviceable. It's going to be utilitarian, but we want to do a decent job and we want to have it be maintainable. Anything we do, we want to be reversible and we want to be able to continue to maintain it in a reasonable fashion. So I think that's what I'll do for the second video this weekend. Please like and subscribe. You have been doing a great job and I thank you all for the views. I would like to see some more comments for feedback, just so I can see where I'm making hits and misses. Sometimes I look at the views on the videos and there's a lot of disparity between the number of views, and I'm trying to sort of make a correlation between the number of views and the type of content or the length of the video. I'm trying to understand what matters to the viewers. So if you could give me some insight, I would be very appreciative. So until the next episode, thank you very much.